Everyone knows about the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, or the Rwandan genocide, but there's one genocide that achieved a 97% extermination rate, higher than any of these, and most people have never heard of it. Between 1880 and 1930, a publicly traded company systematically eliminated an entire indigenous people in South America. They paid bounties for each person killed. They required physical proof of death. They specifically targeted women and children to prevent reproduction. The Selknam people went from over 3,000 individuals to fewer than 100 survivors in 50 years. This is the Forgotten Genocide and why it matters now. Picture the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, land of fire. For over 10,000 years, this was home to the Selknam people, master hunters who had adapted to one of Earth's most challenging environments. This wasn't just survival, this was sophisticated civilization. The Selknam had complex territorial systems, spiritual ceremonies that lasted weeks, and hunting techniques so advanced they could take down Wanako, South American llamas in Arctic conditions. According to anthropologist Anne Chapman, who interviewed the last survivors in the 1960s, they lived in organized family groups with populations around 3,500 to 4,000 people when Europeans first arrived. Until the 1870s, their main contact with Europeans was actually rescuing shipwreck survivors. Chapman's interviews reveal that the Selknam often saved and protected stranded Europeans. But around 1880, everything changed. European businessmen discovered that Tierra del Fuego's grasslands were perfect for sheep farming. There was just one problem. Indigenous people were already living there. Here's where this gets disturbing. This wasn't random frontier violence. This was systematic extermination designed by corporate executives with government backing. The mastermind was José Menéndez, a Spanish businessman who developed massive sheep operations. According to survivor testimony recorded by Chapman, Menéndez got permission from the government to kill them. Menéndez employed Alexander McLennan, nicknamed Chancho Colorado, or Red Pig, as his administrator and primary executioner. Here's how the system worked. Step 1. Hunters were paid £1 sterling for each head. That's about $150 today. Step 2. They had to bring physical proof, ears, body parts, to receive payment. Step 3. They paid extra for killing women. Federico, a survivor interviewed by Chapman, explained, for women they cut off the breasts, then they paid a little more for the women. This wasn't about protecting livestock. This was about preventing reproduction to ensure complete elimination. In 1886, Romanian engineer Julius Popper actually photographed himself standing over indigenous bodies he just killed. This was documentation for investors. Proof that the Indian problem was being solved. This wasn't aberrant behavior. This was a business model that historian David Stannard calls extraction-based genocide. Systematic elimination of indigenous peoples to access land and resources for maximum profit. Let me tell you about Lola Kiepja. Born around 1874, she lived through this genocide and became the last traditional Selknam shaman. Chapman worked with Kiepja until her death in 1966, recording 47 traditional chants, the last direct link to 10,000 years of culture. Kiepja remembered specific massacres, naming the killers, describing the systematic nature of the extermination. Chapman calculated the demographic collapse precisely. 3,500 people in 1880, fewer than 100 by 1930. That's a 97% extermination rate, higher than the Jewish Holocaust, higher than Rwanda. Kiepja described the massacre at Cabo Peñas, where McLennan positioned armed guards with Winchester rifles during high tide. Families gathering shellfish were trapped against cliffs as the tide rose. According to survivor testimony, women and children were crowded where the cliff was, and there they drowned them all. Only one person survived by hiding in the rocks. These weren't combat deaths. They were systematic executions of entire families. They were witnessing a prototype. The Selknam genocide wasn't unique. It was a template. The same pattern appears across Latin America whenever indigenous people live on land with valuable resources. Amazon rubber boom. 40,000 indigenous people killed by British companies for rubber profits. California gold rush. 95% of indigenous people exterminated through state-sponsored bounty hunting. Guatemala in the 1980s. 200,000 people killed, with 83% of the victims being indigenous. Corporate genocide requires government support. Companies like Menendez's obtained official permission to remove indigenous populations. When survivors tried to seek justice, Judge Waldo Sequel deliberately protected the perpetrators by falsely claiming inability to find translators. This pattern continues today. 70 indigenous peoples in Brazil currently face extinction. Between 2012 and 2020, 363 indigenous activists were murdered across Latin America. Indigenous people comprise 1/3 of murdered environmental defenders globally. Mining companies, agribusinesses, extractive industries continue targeting indigenous territories using legal frameworks, hired violence, and government complicity. Until 2020, 90 years later, Chile officially considered the Selknam extinct. If they don't exist, there's no crime to acknowledge. But here's what the corporate executioners didn't count on: survival and resistance. Current census data records over 1,000 self-identified Selknam in Chile and thousands more in Argentina. Descendant communities like Corporación Selknam are fighting for territorial rights, cultural recognition, and justice. Indigenous communities worldwide are fighting the same extractive violence that Chapman documented. They're not just victims. They're the primary opposition to systems that prioritize corporate profit over human survival. And this matters to everyone, because the same systems that eliminated the Selknam are driving climate change, environmental destruction, and resource wars that affect all of us. Anne Chapman spent decades documenting the Selknam genocide because she understood that memory is resistance. Her work proves that systematic extermination operates through formal business structures with government sanction. Therefore, recognizing these patterns helps us understand contemporary conflicts. Therefore, supporting indigenous resistance helps disrupt these systems. Therefore, this isn't just history, it's a blueprint for action. I've linked organizations in the description supporting indigenous communities fighting these systems. These aren't charities, they're resistance movements that need strategic support. What surprised you most about this documented genocide? How do you see these patterns operating today? Drop a comment below, because recognizing these systems is the first step in disrupting them. The Selknam deserved better. Indigenous people today deserve better. Chapman's research gives us the evidence to understand how genocide works and the responsibility to stop it from continuing.